identities. And today she's going to talk about Mediterranean monsters, disability, gender and moral geography in Gower's professor. Mantis, over to you, Kai.
Just a moment, get me going.
Yep.
I timed this to like 19 minutes and 40 seconds.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. I'm just very careful about the time today because we are running late. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, kindly.
So my paper evolved a little bit since the proposal. So the title is The Divided Mediterranean: Blindness, Monstrosity, and Perceptual Geography in Gower's Tale of Constance. So Gower's Mediterranean is not merely a space of movement, it is a space of interpretation. The Tale of Constance transforms the Mediterranean from a geography of travel into a geography of perception, where identities are continually shaped by acts of reading and misreading. As Constance moves across maritime, political, and religious boundaries, she remains fundamentally the same figure. However, she acquires different meanings within the shifting interpretive communities through which she passes. Her identity becomes contingent upon acts of recognition that repeatedly prove unstable. Narrated in Book 2 of the Perceptual as part of Genius's discussion Envy, the Tale of Constance recounts the repeated exile and maritime displacement of Constance, daughter of the Roman emperor, as she is driven across the Mediterranean through cycles of conversion, persecution, false accusation, and miraculous preservation. Moving between Christian and Islamic courts, Constance becomes a figure whose bodily and spiritual meaning is continually reinterpreted according to unstable cultural environments through which she travels. Her journeys transform the Mediterranean into a contested space of fractured interpretation and uncertain legibility. Recent scholarship on the medieval Mediterranean has emphasized the region as a space simultaneously characterized by exchange and vision. Emily Kulik-Ritchie, for example, explores how the Mediterranean networks foster both connection and fragmentation. Gower participates in this tradition by presenting what might be called a divided Mediterranean, a world in which cultural contact repeatedly generates interpretive instability rather than mutual understanding. The sea does not reveal identity so much as expose the fragility of the interpretive systems through which identity becomes known. Mediterranean movement does not reliably produce knowledge. Instead, it repeatedly exposes the limits of observation, judgment, and understanding. Will Rogers observes, while Constance is a constant in the tale, she is seen, but rarely sees. This imbalance between seeing and being seen governs the narrative. Blindness becomes associated with insight, while visual certainty repeatedly collapses into error. Characters misread bodies, faith, evidence, and identity. The Mediterranean emerges not simply as a setting, but as a symbolic system, a destabilizing contact zone in which identities are continuously negotiated, obscured, and rewritten through exile, conversion, and misrecognition. This instability manifests itself in three related forms: the misrecognition of religious difference, the destabilizing effects of maritime displacement, and the transformation of Constance into a figure of monstrosity. Together, these episodes reveal how Gower constructs the Mediterranean as a divided, interpretive world, in which movement continually tests the ability of individuals and communities to perceive. The Tale of Constance ultimately presents the Mediterranean not as a coherent space of exchange or connectivity, but as a fractured and contested symbolic sea in which blindness, nobility, monstrosity, and religious alterity destabilize systems of morale and cultural legibility. Gower's Mediterranean is therefore never neutral. It is a space through which identities are continuously negotiated, obscured, and rewritten through movement across unstable geographic, religious, and interpretive boundaries. Within this divided Mediterranean world, religious identity becomes increasingly dependent upon process of misrecognition. The narrative repeatedly constructs Islamic alterity through obscured vision, distorted insight, and monstrous projection, rendering the Mediterranean a space of what might be termed monstrous misrecognition. Yet the tale simultaneously reveals the profound cultural interdependence it attempts to suppress. Encounters with Islamic spaces and bodies thus expose the instability of supposedly fixed Christian and non-Christian identity. That tension between divine structure and human interpretive failure is very Gowerian. Mediterranean movement repeatedly produces failures of interpretations. Blindness paradoxically becomes associated with truth, while visual certainty repeatedly collapses into error. The sea itself functions as a stabilizing medium that renders identity contingent and legibility uncertain. Constance herself becomes the primary site upon which these unstable systems of interpretation operate. Throughout the narrative, her body is repeatedly subjected to acts of reading by various political, religious, and cultural communities through which she passes. Yet these readings remain radically contingent upon the environment and circumstance rather than truth. Constance is alternatively interpreted as saintly, political bride, monstrous mother, criminal, foreign exile, or miraculous instrument of divine power. Her identity never stabilizes fully within any single interpretive framework. This instability emerges immediately through the tale's emphasis upon mediated rather than direct encounter. The Sultan first encounters Constance not visually, but through mercantile narration and rumor. The merchant describes the beauty and the grace of Constance before he ever sees her himself. Constance therefore enters the Mediterranean economy already transformed into its object of circulation, whose identity is constructed through report, commerce, and narrative transmission. Significantly, the merchants who facilitate this circulation are themselves figures in Mediterranean exchange, of him which he views a merchant be. Trade networks become simultaneously networks of religious conversion, cultural contact, and unstable bodily legibility. The Mediterranean thus functions not merely as a geographic space, but as an interpretive system. Constance's body acquires different meanings depending upon who observes her and within what cultural framework. Her sanctity becomes inseparable from the unstable interpretations through which she is understood. This instability of interpretation reaches one of its clearest expressions in the murder of Hermegeld, that guy, and the false accusations against Constance. The scene constructs a visual evidence of itself as a blank page. Fundamentally unstable. The bloody knife planted beside Constance appears to provide irrefutable proof of guilt. Lo, safe beneath, all bloody here. Yet apparent certainty of sight conceals a deeper falsity. The eye becomes vulnerable to manipulation, while visual evidence fails to correspond to truth. This evidence further intensifies the tale's association between blindness and failed moral discernment through divine intervention against the perjured knight. After swearing falsely upon the Bible, the hand of heaven him smote, and he hath both his e'en lore. Physical blindness here externalizes spiritual corruption. The knight who falsely interprets Constance loses the very organs through which he claims interpretive authority. At the same time, the narrative repeatedly grants spiritual insight into figures marked by literal blindness or limited vision. The blind man healed through that guy's invocation of Christian faith paradoxically perceives divine truth more clearly than many cited characters within the tale. Gower therefore destabilizes conventional associations between sight and knowledge. Vision no longer guarantees understanding. Rather, sight itself becomes vulnerable to distortion, projection, and moral failure. This failure of perception extends beyond individual characters to the narrative's larger understanding of events. The sea appears chaotic, but providence operates beneath it. The characters themselves cannot perceive that providential order while they inhabit the narrative. The Mediterranean movement repeatedly produces failures of such interpretations. The forces actually shaping events remain inaccessible to ordinary sight. The result is a Mediterranean world in which identities remain vulnerable to competing acts of interpretation. To begin, I turn to the figure of the Sultan's mother. Rather than reading her as a stock villain, she demonstrates the ways in which the tale constructs religious and cultural difference through acts of misrecognition. The Sultan's mother inaugurates the narrative pattern of the monstrous misrecognition that recurs throughout the tale by transforming Constance from a diplomatic bride into a political and religious threat. Significantly, this interpretation emerges before any direct encounter between the two women. The Sultan's mother responds not to Constance herself, but to reports of her beauty, sanctity, and influence. Constance is therefore interpreted through narrative mediation long before she enters the Sultan's court. Mediterranean networks of trade and communication transmit not only people and goods, but also anxieties, assumptions, and distortions. As a result, Constance becomes legible not as a person, but as an idea upon which others project their fears. The Sultan's mother thus becomes the tale's first great reader of Constance, and its first veiled interpreter. In each case, Constance's identity is determined not by truth, but by the interpretive framework imposed upon her by others. The pattern begins here. The Sultan's mother reads Constance as a threat, not because of any action Constance has taken, but because she represents a challenge to the existing structures of authority. As she laments, "There I have lost my joys here, for mine estate shall be so last." Her concern is neither doctrinal nor moral. It's political. She fears the diminution of her own power. What follows is therefore best understood through the acts of monstrous misrecognition. The Sultan's mother sees only a symbolic rival whose arrival threatens her position within the court. Her response transforms a proposed marriage intended to unite communities into an act of catastrophic violence. The massacre that follows converts what appears to be a moment of Mediterranean exchange into a scene of bloodshed and fragmentation. Gower thus presents cross-cultural encounter not as a process that necessarily produces understanding, but as one that may instead expose the instability of categories through which individuals perceive religious and cultural difference. The tragedy originates not in Constance herself, but in the inability of others to see her clearly. The Sultan's mother transforms Constance into a political and religious symbol. She cannot afford to understand Constance as a person because Constance has become a screen onto which anxieties about power, conversion, and cultural exchange are projected. Misrecognition thus emerges as the tale's governing Mediterranean mode. The first major cross-cultural encounter in the narrative collapses, not because of religious differences that prove irreconcilable, but because the participants prove incapable of reading one another correctly. Gower locates the tragedy not in religious difference, but in the inability of individuals. The Sultan's mother's misreading of, hold on, I think I've gone, have I gone too far? I think I missed a slide. Oh well. The Sultan's mother misreading of Constance initiates a pattern that maritime displacement subsequently intensifies. Once cast adrift upon the Mediterranean, Constance becomes detached from social, political, and familiar structures. These have previously rendered her legible. Mediterranean movement does not clarify. Instead, it suspends the interpretive frameworks through which identity is recognized. The ship becomes a distinctly Mediterranean space. No, something's wrong here. The ship becomes a distinctly Mediterranean space of interpretive suspension. A vessel moving between political territories, religious communities, and systems of social recognition, it occupies neither one world nor the other. Gower emphasizes this instability as describing it as a naked ship without a steer. Detached from human governance and visual direction, the vessel becomes a figure for the uncertainty that increasingly surrounds Constance's identity. There is no steersman, no fixed destination, no human authority capable of directing its course. The ship drifts beyond structures that ordinarily confer meaning and orientation. At the same time, the narrative introduces a tension between divine providence and human perception. The audience is repeatedly reminded that the ship is not directionless. God remains active beneath the apparent chaos of the sea. But he with all things may comforted thee. And later with, the mighty goddess hand here hath conveyed and defended. The Mediterranean thus becomes a space in which the limits of human perception are exposed. If the sea strips away the categories through which Constance can be recognized, her arrival in Northumbria exposes what happens when one other attempts to reconstruct these categories anew. Detached from her previous identity and unwilling to disclose her origins, Constance becomes vulnerable to competing acts of interpretation. Those who encounter her must construct explanations for who she is and what she signifies. The exit of the blind man reveals that these acts of reading are governed less by visible evidence and more by spiritual disposition. As elsewhere in the tale, sight proves an unreliable guide to truth, while blindness paradoxically becomes associated with a clearer form of perception. The ship thus becomes the tale's most concentrated Mediterranean image, a floating interpretive void in which ordinary systems of reading bodies, identities, and intentions seeks to function. What appears to human observers as randomness and disorder is revealed only retrospectively as providential design. The sea, therefore, exposes the limits of human perception while simultaneously affirming the existence of a divine order that remains inaccessible to ordinary sight. Maritime movement repeatedly places Constance in the hands of those who must determine who she is, yet those determinations prove unstable and often disastrously wrong. The Mediterranean thus becomes a space in which identities remain vulnerable to competing acts of interpretation. This section goes back. The instability of perception that characterizes the episodes reaches its most extreme expression in Villeneuve's forged correspondence. If the false accusation of murder demonstrates the unreliable visible evidence, the forged letters reveal how narrative itself can malfunction alternative realities. Through the manipulation of written testimony, Constance is transformed from a miraculous Christian queen into a figure associated with monstrosity and supernatural disorder. The language of the forged letter is especially revealing. Constance is not accused of sin, treason, or murder. Instead, the letter claims that she is of fairy. The charge operates on a different level from the earlier accusations directed against her. Rather than condemning her action, it calls into question her very nature. The phrase places Constance outside of ordinary categories of human identity and relocates her within a realm of supernatural alterity. Faced with a figure who repeatedly resists stable categorization, the community produces a narrative capable of containing her. The designation of fairy thus functions less as a description of Constance than as a confession of interpretive inadequacy. Unable to account for her through ordinary social categories, her observers resort to a language of marvelous and monstrous. Significantly, this monstrous reading emerges only after prolonged displacement across Mediterranean spaces. Repeated exile has stripped Constance of the social structures that once guaranteed her legibility. Removed from Rome, detached from family, and separated from institutions that authenticated her identity, she becomes vulnerable to increasingly unstable acts of interpretation. Monstrosity emerges not from the body itself, but from the conditions that make the body difficult to read. The accusation of fairy origin therefore represents the culmination of the tale's ongoing crisis of perception. Constance herself never changes. What changes are the interpretive communities through which she passes. The tale begins in Rome with a seemingly stable and legible Constance, whose identity is publicly recognized and socially authenticated. By the narrative's end, however, that stability has been repeatedly dismantled through exile, maritime displacement, false testimony, miraculous intervention, and persistent acts of misrecognition. The Mediterranean does not reveal identity so much as expose the fragility of the system through which identity is known. Therefore, Gower's Mediterranean is not a space of transparent exchange or mutual understanding. Rather, it is a geography of uncertain vision. As Constance moves across political, religious, and maritime boundaries, she is successively interpreted as saint, bride, exile, criminal, monster, and miracle worker. Yet none of these readings accurately captures the woman at the center of the tale. Again and again, the narrative shows that sight is vulnerable to manipulation, prejudice, rumor, and desire. Those who claim certainty prove most vulnerable to error, while blindness paradoxically becomes associated with forms of insight unavailable to the sighted. What emerges is a Mediterranean world in which meaning itself remains contingent. Constance herself changes remarkably little over the course of the narrative. What changes are the interpretive communities through which she passes and the meanings that they attach to her. The same woman may be read as holy, threatening, foreign, or monstrous, depending on the cultural framework through which she is viewed. The greatest danger of Mediterranean movement is therefore not physical displacement, but interpretive instability. Gower's sea separates more than kingdoms and faiths. It exposes the limits of human perception itself. In a world governed by providence, yet experienced through imperfect vision, the central challenge is not simply to travel across the Mediterranean, but to interpret correctly what one encounters there. The Tale of Constance ultimately imagines the Mediterranean not as a stable corridor of exchange, but as a contested interpretive world in which movement continually tests the ability of individuals and communities to truly see. Thank you.